The night Hungary was born didn't begin with a crown. It began with blood, doubt, and a boy raised between two worlds, one foot in pagan fire, the other in Christian steel, while the land itself refused to choose a future. Because before he was called Saint Stephen, he was Vike, a prince surrounded by tribal warlords who believed gods lived in trees and victories were earned with axes, and every step he took toward unity felt like betrayal to someone watching him closely in the dark. Because this land was not empty, it was loud, divided, violent, and allergic to change, and the boy learned early that survival here didn't come from kindness but from timing. And when his father Geza forced Christianity onto the tribes with threats instead of faith, Vike watched and understood something dangerous. Fear can convert bodies, but only belief can convert history. And when Geza died, the ground shook not with grief, but with ambition, because tradition demanded that the strongest pagan leader take control, not the son. And Koppány rose, claiming the old laws, old gods, and old blood, promising freedom from foreign crosses. And in that moment, Hungary stood at a cliff edge, because if Vike lost, Christianity would burn with him, and if he won, blood would seal the future forever. And he chose not to hesitate, not to negotiate, not to run, because hesitation kills kings before swords do. So he took a name sharper than Vike. He became Stephen, aligning himself with Rome, with steel-armored knights, with a vision no one around him fully understood yet. And when the battle came, it wasn't just armies colliding, it was centuries crashing together, pagan drums against church bells, chaos against structure. And when Koppány fell, his body was cut apart and displayed across the land, not out of cruelty alone, but as a message written in flesh: the old world is over. And fear carried that message faster than mercy ever could, and Stephen knew the cost, because every victory pushed him further from the people he was born into and closer to the ruler he needed to become. And when the crown finally came from Rome around the year 1000, it wasn't a reward, it was a chain, because kings who build nations don't get to live as men anymore. The crown didn't make Stephen powerful, it isolated him. Because the moment gold touched his head, everyone around him started measuring what they could take. And a kingdom stitched together by force doesn't stay together by hope. So Stephen moved fast, ruthless but precise, breaking the land into counties, placing loyal officials where tribal chiefs once ruled, not asking permission, not explaining himself, because explanations invite rebellion. And churches began rising where sacred groves once stood, stone replacing wood, silence replacing chants. And people called it progress while secretly mourning what was being buried alive. And Stephen understood that faith imposed by sword rots unless law protects it. So he wrote laws not for saints but for sinners, punishing pagan rituals, enforcing Sunday rest, demanding obedience not to gods in the sky but to order on the ground. And every decree tightened the kingdom like a knot pulled too hard to loosen later. Because Stephen wasn't building comfort, he was building permanence. And permanence requires sacrifice, including his own blood. Because while enemies outside tested borders, the real threat grew inside his palace, his son Emmerich, the future he'd built everything for, the only person meant to inherit a stable Christian Hungary, died suddenly, violently, leaving Stephen staring at an empty throne and realizing nations don't care about your plans. And the irony was cruel. The man who defeated pagans, bent tribes, and reshaped history couldn't protect his own legacy. And from that moment, his rule hardened, quieter, colder, as if grief burned away what softness remained, because the kingdom had to outlive him, even if joy wouldn't. And when rebellions flared again, Stephen crushed them without hesitation, not because he wanted to, but because mercy now would undo decades of blood already spilled. And so Hungary survived not because it was gentle, but because it was disciplined, forged like steel that remembers every strike that shaped it. By the time Stephen grew old, the land obeyed him but no longer loved him, and he accepted that trade without complaint, because love fades but structure endures, and every road, church, and law he left behind was a silent argument against chaos. Yet at night the weight returned, heavier than armor, because saints aren't born from victories, they're carved from endurance. And Stephen endured a kingdom that could collapse the moment he closed his eyes. So he did the unthinkable. He offered Hungary itself to the Virgin Mary, not as symbolism, but as surrender, admitting that human control ends somewhere no crown can reach. And when he died in 1038, there was no dramatic ending, no final speech, just a ruler leaving behind a system strong enough to survive weak men. And that was his real miracle. Because after him came disorder, foreign kings, internal betrayal, and still Hungary didn't disappear. It bent, cracked, and bled, but it stayed. And centuries later, when the church named him a saint, it wasn't for kindness or mercy. It was because he chose the harder path when the easier one would have erased his people. And even now, the crown he wore isn't just an artifact, it's a warning that nations aren't born from dreams alone. They're born when someone is willing to be remembered as cruel so their land can be remembered at all. Long after Stephen's bones were sealed away, his shadow kept ruling. Because every king who followed had to answer one question he left behind. Do you rule like a man, or do you rule like a foundation? And most failed because foundations don't bend to ego. And Hungary learned that the hard way, through invasions, fractures, and crowns passed to men who wanted power without responsibility. Yet the structures Stephen built kept pulling the country back from collapse like an unseen spine. Monasteries preserving memory while armies destroyed cities. Laws echoing his voice even when no one remembered his face. And the truth is uncomfortable but real. Hungary didn't survive because it was lucky. It survived because it was redesigned at the exact moment it could have vanished. And that redesign required a ruler willing to kill the past before the future arrived. And that's why Stephen remains dangerous to remember, because his story doesn't comfort, it challenges, asking whether stability is worth the cost paid by those who lived through its creation, and whether any nation truly forms without someone carrying the burden of being hated first so others can belong later.
The danger in Stephen's story isn't history. It's the mirror it holds up, because every generation wants the result without the pain, the nation without the fracture, the order without the force, and Hungary kept testing that illusion again and again, through foreign dynasties and internal betrayals, through moments where the crown passed to rulers who mistook inheritance for destiny. Yet the blueprint never vanished, because Stephen didn't just rule time, he bent it, locking his decisions into the future so deeply that even his mistakes became reference points. And when invaders came later, they didn't conquer emptiness, they collided with identity. A Christian kingdom with borders, law, and memory, not a loose confederation waiting to dissolve. And that distinction mattered more than armies, because empires fall fastest where nothing holds people together, and Stephen made sure something always would, even if it was fear at first and faith later. And this is why his sainthood feels uncomfortable, because saints are expected to heal, not harden. But Stephen's miracle wasn't mercy, it was survival, and survival is rarely gentle. And when Hungarians still look back to him, they're not searching for comfort. They're asking how much strength a nation needs to endure a world that never stops testing it.
Stephen's legacy didn't end in churches or laws. It lived in the instinct to resist disappearance. Because once a people understand they nearly ceased to exist, memory becomes armor. And Hungary carried that armor into every century that followed, through moments where the crown changed hands under pressure, through times when foreign rulers sat on a throne built by someone else's blood, and yet the idea of Hungary refused to dissolve, because ideas outlive rulers when they're forged under threat. And Stephen ruled at the exact moment when hesitation would have erased everything. So later generations inherited not peace but endurance, and endurance shaped their identity more than victory ever could, because victory fades but survival teaches discipline. And this is why Stephen still matters, not as a flawless saint, not as a gentle father, but as proof that history doesn't reward purity, it rewards decisiveness. And the uncomfortable truth remains that without his severity, there may have been no Hungary left to argue about him at all, only a footnote swallowed by stronger neighbors. And that's the final weight of his story, that sometimes the man who saves a nation is never the one the nation would choose, but he's the one it needed when time was running out.
And that's why Stephen's story refuses to fade into legend, because it never resolves cleanly. It stays sharp, unresolved, almost accusatory, forcing anyone who studies it to confront a truth most histories soften with heroism, that nations are not born in moments of unity, but in moments of rupture. And Stephen ruled during a rupture so deep that choosing the wrong side wouldn't have meant losing a battle, it would have meant vanishing entirely. And Hungary's later sufferings under invasions, partitions, and domination only reinforces that point, because those storms were endured by a state that already knew how close extinction felt, and Stephen gave it that memory at birth, embedding resilience into its identity before comfort ever had a chance to weaken it. And while modern eyes may flinch at his methods, history doesn't measure rulers by intentions alone. It measures them by what remains when they're gone. And what remained after Stephen was not a tribe, not a loose alliance, not a name waiting to be erased, but a kingdom with a spine strong enough to break and still stand again. And that is why his legacy survives argument, criticism, and time itself, because it was never built to be liked, only to last.
What makes Stephen's legacy endure isn't reverence, it's tension, because his life sits uncomfortably between faith and force, vision and violence, and that tension never resolves. It simply passes forward, shaping how Hungary understands power, loss, and survival. And even today, when his name is spoken, it isn't spoken softly. It carries weight, because he represents the moment when choice replaced drift, when a people stopped reacting and started defining themselves. And that moment cost lives, traditions, and innocence, but it bought time. And time is the one thing history never gives twice. And Stephen spent it without hesitation, knowing the judgment wouldn't fall on him alone, but on the future he forced into existence. And maybe that's why his story still matters, because it doesn't offer comfort or easy pride. It offers responsibility, the reminder that what exists now was paid for before by someone willing to stand alone, be feared, be misunderstood, and still move forward. And whether he was king or saint matters less than this single truth he proved, that survival is never accidental. It is chosen again and again, even when the choice scars the chooser forever.
In the end, Stephen's life closes the way all true founding stories do, not with celebration, but with silence, because once the foundations are set, the builder disappears beneath them. And Hungary moved on without him, stumbling, suffering, sometimes betraying everything he tried to stabilize, yet never fully losing the shape he gave it. And that is the quiet cruelty of legacy, that the man who carries the heaviest burden rarely gets to see gratitude, only consequence. And Stephen accepted that long before his death, understanding that history doesn't need its founders to be happy, it needs them to be final. And so his choices hardened into tradition, his laws into instinct, his fear into discipline, until generations who never knew his name still lived inside the boundaries he drew. And when Hungary faced annihilation centuries later, it was not courage alone that saved it, but memory. The memory of having once stood at the edge and chosen existence over comfort, order over chaos, endurance over purity. And that is why Stephen remains impossible to simplify, because he was not a hero made to be loved, nor a tyrant meant to be rejected. He was a moment in time where hesitation would have erased a people, and someone stepped forward and refused to let that happen, paying the price in blood, loneliness, and doubt so a nation could inherit something rarer than glory, the chance to continue. And that is the final truth of his story. that Hungary did not begin with hope, it began with resolve, and resolve, once chosen, echoes longer than any crown ever could.